To so much as utter the words Roman general immediately conjures to mind one man above all others, Julius Caesar. He is often remembered as Rome's greatest general, as a matter of fact, even despite other men having arguably made greater contributions to Roman military strategy, greater achievements for Roman its geopolitical standing, and greater additions to Rome's territory. In politics, Caesar is sometimes remembered as Rome's first dictator or even its first emperor, despite the fact that he was neither. Lucius Cornelius Sulla having been the first to take the role of dictator by force, while Caesar's heir Augustus had become Rome's first emperor. This isn't to reduce Caesar's role in Roman history at all. In fact, it makes perfect sense for him to be as well remembered as he is today. Not only was he instrumental to Rome's conversion from crumbling republic to rising empire, but his life story itself is a captivating and inspiring epic of a boy born at the turn of the century to one of Rome's most noble families, who witnessed the republic he was raised to believe in succumb to corruption, political violence, war, and tyranny. Rome's new tyrant would then see to persecuting this boy for being the nephew of his old adversary, eventually forcing this boy to enlist in the military to escape threats on his life back home. When he finally returned upon the tyrant's death, he returned a disciplined soldier, but one now without a penny to his name. Essentially starting from scratch, he took on legal work, earning wide acclaim for his speaking skills, before going into politics where he would work his way up to the consulship. He'd go on to conquer Gaul and fight a civil war for the future of Rome, a war that he would win, allowing him the opportunity to rule Rome alone. There is, however, another side to this story. At age 18, a young man by the name of Gnaeus Pompeius bore witness to the outbreak of civil war between Sulla and his adversary Gaius Marius, the war costing Pompey's father his life. By age 22, Pompeius had assumed command of his father's legions and led them in support of Sulla, who was so impressed by Pompey's efforts that the two became close, Pompey essentially becoming his protege. Sulla would later task him with suppressing any remaining dissidents in the regions of Sicily and North Africa, doing so successfully and earning him the title of Pompey the Great, something he took great pride in, likening himself to Alexander the Great. It is by this point that we see a few key characteristics of Pompey emerge. On one hand, he demonstrated tremendous loyalty to his commander, standing by him even in the face of mutiny, and harshly punishing his enemies. On the other hand, he showed great compassion towards civilians, something which earned him much adoration and respect from the masses. Transcending this, however, was a rising sense of his own greatness. From the lowest pleb to his commanding dictator, he was repeatedly reminded of how much eminence he carried, contributing to his growing aspirations but also to an emerging darkness within himself. The first time Pompey's ego overcame his morals of loyalty and compassion is made very clear when he challenged Sulla's decision on whether or not to award him a triumph, a military parade typically only allotted to much older and higher-ranking politicians. Pompey is alleged to have suggested that Sulla and the older generation, great as they might have been, have already enjoyed their peak of power and were in decline, whilst he, as a successful military man at such a young age, had only just begun to ascend to what was sure to be an unprecedented level of power. Sulla was so impressed by the confidence Pompey had in saying such a thing to a man who could have easily had him exiled or killed, that he was immediately awarded his triumph, Sulla hoping that this would keep the promising young man in his corner for the foreseeable future. But as time went on, Pompey's ambitions grew greater, his actions became bolder, and his relationship with Sulla fractured shortly before the former dictator's death. In the post-Sulla period, political divisions within Rome began to re-emerge, and despite the strain between them, Pompey continued to stand by Sulla's teachings and his optimate political faction. Pompey, with his vast armies, would go on to defend Rome against political rival and military general Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who had attempted to launch his own march on Rome. Pompey's victory in this conflict earning him greater public acclaim, and reinforcing his view of himself as Rome's greatest soldier. Fresh off of that rebellion, Pompey would be called upon to put down another rebellion in the region of Hispania, which had come under the control of Quintus Sertorius, an old enemy of Sulla who had escaped persecution and rallied behind him the local tribes of Hispania against the Roman administration there. One might argue that Pompey coerced his way into this campaign as he refused to disband his armies within Rome unless he was sent to Hispania. If nothing else, it once again demonstrates his rising sense of superiority and lust for additional military victories, sending a message to the politicians that he alone held command over his men, not them, and as he brought more and more achievements to his name, so did his popularity rise among the people, earning him greater power across Rome. Though he was able to force Sertorius into retreat, throughout the conflict his desire for glory drove him to act uncooperatively with his fellow general Quintus Metellus and with the government back in Rome, refusing to be seen as a secondary figure in the conflict instead of the man who finished it largely on his own. Pompey grew so bold that he threatened to march his army back to Rome if he wasn't given additional funding to continue and intensify his campaign. The rebellion would ultimately be put down and Hispania restabilized, earning Pompey his second triumph. But before that, Pompey would be called to suppress yet another rebellion, this having been the slave rebellion led by Spartacus. It would be here that he would steal the thunder and glory of a future ally and rival, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the famed richest man in all of Rome. The two men would be elected to the office of consul the following year, Pompey having reached this highest office in the Republic without having served in any political position prior, and doing so well below the age limit. As consul, Pompey once again strayed further away from his political roots under Sulla. Though Sulla had established himself as dictator, he did so temporarily as an extreme measure to set the Republic back on track after years of instability. He desired above all else for the Roman Republic to resume functioning as it once had. That meant restoring majority power to the patrician senators, and dialing back certain powers allotted to the lower-class plebs, who Sulla recognized as uneducated and morally weak, being easily swayed by popular opinion and emotion. Pompey likely recognized this to a degree as well, but unlike Sulla, sought to restore plebeian power. And though some might say that he acted out of compassion, it is perhaps more realistic to say he did so as a cunning strategic move. Pompey knew that he held the admiration of the public. He was essentially Rome's greatest celebrity. However, the Senate was wise to his ambitions and sometimes underhanded nature, especially in regard to using military threats to force political cooperation. This left the Senate very weary of Pompey and likely to curtail his influence at the first opportunity. This could not be achieved if the plebs who loved Pompey had an equal say in the matter. In essence, Pompey knew that he could manipulate the common Roman into granting him more power, and so campaigned on restoring their political rights to secure his own place in politics. In the span of only 2 years, Pompey's powers were expanded widely. The Lex Gabinia, a law meant to make the combating of piracy easier, granted Pompey direct control over all lands 50 miles inland from the shore of the Mediterranean, while the Lex Manilia gave him direct military command in Anatolia during the war against the Kingdom of Pontus. During his war against piracy, Pompey divided the sea into 13 districts, each under the control of a commander answering directly to him. Very quickly they began capturing pirate ships, but Pompey, taking pity on these men who he felt were driven to a life of crime by poor circumstances, pardoned several of them and resettled these men in unoccupied or underpopulated lands in the east, earning their respect and loyalty. In the east, Pompey would seize command away from Lucius Licinius Lucullus via the Lex Manilia, much to Lucullus's displeasure, feeling as though Pompey was stealing his campaign away from him while it was already underway, just to add an easy military victory to his name. Though Pompey did seek to enrich his military prestige, this wasn't an easy war to pick up. Pompey would be forced to essentially chase down the enemy king, toppling and conquering his allies in the process. When Pompey did return to Rome, he returned as the conqueror of the Near East, and would be awarded a third triumph, the largest in Rome's history, mind you. He had successfully conquered hundreds of cities, brought to submission 14 new states, and claimed several millions worth of loot from the defeated kingdoms, 75 million being taken in silver coin alone. The campaign had been so successful and profitable that Crassus no longer stood as the richest man in Rome, that title now falling to Pompey. The fame and admiration had been intoxicating, but still he desired more. He was Rome's greatest living military mind and one almost certain to go down in history as the Alexander the Great of his nation. He held access to an unmatched bounty of wealth with which he could finance virtually any project or mission he desired. He had held the office of consul, the highest office in the Republic, but his upbringing had shown him that there was a higher rank one could ascend to if they had the courage, the might, and the mind to do so, the rank of dictator. Pompey knew that if Sulla had been able to do so before him, then he, with his vast wealth, armies, and support from the public, had no excuse not to reach the same heights his mentor had. That dream, however, would be challenged by the rapid rise to prominence of Julius Caesar. While initially the two had cooperated to advance each other's careers, this rivalry grew especially fierce, particularly on the side of Pompey, whose confidence and ego were shaken by the attention Caesar diverted away from him through his massively successful campaign in Gaul. Fearing that Caesar too held ambitions of seizing the dictatorship by force, Pompey aligned himself with the Senate, who saw Pompey as a lesser of two evils. This escalated into outright civil war upon Caesar's return from his Gallic campaign, refusing to dismiss his single legion unless Pompey did the same. The Senate demanding his immediate disarming at penalty of being labeled a traitor, something far out of the ordinary and which raised alarm for Caesar, prompting him to march on Rome. The early war was characterized by Pompey and the Senate fleeing south and eastward in order to escape Caesar's advance, rallying a larger army along the way before reaching an easily defendable province, even despite the fact that they had, albeit unknowingly, initially outnumbered Caesar's forces 10-1. By the time this had been discovered, Caesar had already received reinforcements and posed a legitimate threat to Pompey's army. In the span of only a few months, the whole of the Italian peninsula would be under Caesar's control, isolated Hispania would be next to fall, and the war was finally brought to Pompey's stronghold in Macedonia, from where he would draw upon the Near East for additional support. Throughout the entire campaign, Caesar attempted to appeal to Pompey, seeking reconciliation and peace, only for Pompey to refuse, knowing well that negotiations would leave him and Caesar equals at best and at worst, place him below his rival. Victory was Pompey's only option. He simply would not settle for second best. However, perhaps overestimating his own abilities or cracking under the pressure of the conflict, Pompey allowed Caesar to get the better of him, rushing into combat against an enemy famed for his quick thinking and innovative strategy, ultimately falling into a trap and seeing his army destroyed. Refusing to surrender, Pompey fled to Egypt expecting a friendly reception, only to be betrayed by the Egyptians who feared that he would bring the Roman war to their lands. Pompey's life was tragically ended there, and Caesar deeply mourned the loss of his rival and former ally. But what if that changed? What if Pompey defeated Caesar? There were a handful of opportunities in which Pompey could have turned the tables on Caesar. Perhaps most popularly discussed is the Battle of Pharsalus, which essentially marked Pompey's defeat, but in which Caesar was significantly disadvantaged, running low on manpower, supplies, and morale, his men facing an army twice their own size and numbers, mind you. Pompey, however, made the mistake of rushing to attack his enemy rather than starving him out and using logistics to his advantage as he had historically done to achieve victory in the past. This rushed effort cost him the fight and his life, but it just as easily might not have. Another more simplistic option is that Pompey and the senators simply not flee, but instead confront Caesar upon his crossing the Rubicon and crush his vastly outnumbered single legion before the war had even begun. In either case, Pompey would not have been as generous to Caesar as Caesar had been to him. In all likelihood, Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon would serve as just cause for him to be proscripted, leaving him to be either exiled or executed. Pompey feared a rival as competent as Caesar when he had already come so far to fulfill his goals, and the Senate feared Caesar's checkered history and alliance with the pro-plebeian popular faction, seeing him as a greater dictatorial threat than Pompey, whom they had at least known and worked with for much longer, judging him to be more reasonable. That being said, comparing the histories of both men, Caesar was definitely the more disciplined and level-headed of the two, allowing his ambition to motivate him but never to overwhelm him as it had Pompey. Caesar was also quick to mend ties with his rivals, having pardoned the senators who had fought against him in this particular war, whereas Pompey was known to hold grudges and quickly size up his peers. If we were to go with the former timeline in which Pompey defeats Caesar at Pharsalus, it's likely he would take advantage of the post-war chaos to establish himself as a dictator immediately. The latter option, in which Caesar is defeated shortly after crossing the Rubicon, would see Pompey continue to consolidate power gradually over the course of a few years, granting himself greater autonomy from the Senate. His untrusting nature and the knowledge that the senators were weary of him may lead Pompey to initiate a series of purges, much as he had witnessed under the dictatorship of Sulla. If he would actually get the chance to do so is up for debate, however. It's often forgotten that despite the fact that the senators aligned themselves with Pompey, they still saw him as a danger to the Republic and an inspiring tyrant. It is almost certain that if Pompey had defeated Caesar and continued on his path of consolidating more power, the senators would assassinate him just as they had Caesar. Pompey's two sons are likely to embark on an avenging mission against the senators, much like Antony and Octavian had done for Caesar, plunging the Republic into another civil war, with the Pompeius brothers likely stationed in Hispania and North Africa. In the off chance that Pompey had survived and remained dictator, there is little chance that he would have embarked on the same expedition Caesar had planned for. The building of an empire to rival that of Alexander the Great had always been Caesar's dream. Pompey simply wanted to be Rome's equivalent, regardless of whether or not Rome's territory surpassed that of Alexander's empire, and after years of campaigns and political maneuvering, defeating Caesar would have allowed him to finally achieve that. To do more would only put his empire at risk. Pompey's sons, on the other hand, might dare to venture farther, and surpass their father once his own time had passed. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.